Commercial and Administrative Law Committee.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the time. I just want to say, Mr. Berman, that I actually agree very much with what you're saying. That is that the nature of prosecution in America is so fundamentally different from the executive branch that you can't merge these two, and that we probably ought to have a more aggressive approach in the executive branch to overseeing the kind of excesses that sometimes happen with prosecutors. And this committee, I think, should be fairly familiar with some of those prosecutions. And in fact, I just want to actually I want to thank Mr. Cohen for making the point of brothers or relatives and cronies, which I take as a reference, a bipartisan reference from this bipartisan committee to the fact that President Clinton gave some very questionable pardons. And first of all, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to ask unanimous consent to have included in the record a story from the Washington Post dated March 7th, 2007, entitled "The Libby Verdict," and the minority views from the Senate by Vice Chairman Bond, joined by Senators Hatch and Burr.
Without objection, or so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Now, I have a love-hate relationship with the Washington Post. I hate it because it tends to be left, and I hate it because they're smart, and they tend to hurt the right when they go left. On the other hand, the fact that they're smart makes them readable and interesting, and this article, I think, is profound because it punctures some balloons here. I don't think there's no question about their saying that Mr. Libby did something wrong. But they're trying to balance things, and they say relatively eloquently what they're trying to balance. And what they're essentially saying is that we have a myth here. And that myth, Mr. Chairman, has been repeated by you and by Mr. Nadler and by Mr. Wexler and by others on your side, and it goes to this nefarious activity of blaming or hurting or going after personally Mr. Wilson. And in the process of that, they lay out the myths that we've heard here today. And let me just go through those. One is that Mr. Wilson was embraced by many because of his early publicly charging that the Bush administration had twisted, if not invented, facts in making the case for war against Iraq. In conversations with journalists in his op-ed, he claimed to have debunked evidence that Iraq was seeking uranium from Niger, suggesting that he had been dispatched by Mr. Cheney to look into the matter, and alleged that his report had circulated at the highest levels of the administration. And it goes on to say that the essentially concludes that what was established out of all this was that all these claims were false. In other words, the left Washington Post calls Mr. Wilson, who is here today, a liar. They're saying he's not true. He's not telling the truth about this. He points out, the article points out the other myth that's here before us today, that somehow, as I recall, I think we've referred to this as a slip of the tongue on the part of Mr. Libby, or was it rather a nefarious scheme to out and to hurt Mr. Wilson? Well, the article points out that it was Richard Armitage, and that the trial provided convincing evidence that there was no conspiracy to punish Mr. Wilson by leaking, here it says Miss Plame's identity, but that would be Mrs. Wilson's identity, and no evidence, in fact, that she was covert. And then in conclusion, the article says, Mr. Wilson's case has besmirched nearly everyone it has touched. The former ambassador will be remembered as a blowhard. Mr. Cheney and Mr. Libby were overbearing in their zeal to rebut Mr. Wilson and careless in their handling of classified information, and Mr. Libby's false subsequent statements were reprehensible. And Mr. Fitzgerald has shown, again, why handling a Washington political case to a federal prosecutor is a prescription for excess. And that's why we're talking about, and why I think Mr. Berman is suggesting we need to have a greater intervention by the President. Now, Mr. Wilson, your wife has given inconsistent testimony to the Senate and the House. I take it in your zeal for getting the truth out, you would encourage her to come to the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform, which is evaluating that. I think there's a letter from the ranking member asking the chairman, Mr. Waxman, to review that. I would take it that given your zeal for truth and getting it all out, you would encourage her to come and meet with staff of the minority and the majority and discuss these matters, would you not?
Congressman, thank you for your questions and your comments. I'm a part-time resident of your state, not of your district, and My condolences to those of your constituents who are suffering through this terrible
Thank you,
fire.
but I do have limited time, and we do have people that are suffering.
The purpose of testifying today, in fact, is to try and get some of the truth out.
Would you encourage your wife to come
My
and
wife
testify?
has testified, Congressman, truthfully, to the best of her ability, to everybody who has asked her.
And yet
those
there were
questions.
fairly substantial inconsistencies. You will acknowledge that, will you?
I don't believe there were inconsistencies.
The record shows
Congressman,
inconsistencies.
but I have not seen
Would
any.
you, pardon me, would you encourage her to come and clarify those inconsistencies?
Congressman, I don't believe that she was inconsistent in her testimony. Neither did she. She
Well,
testified truthfully, honestly, and to the best of her
I see.
ability.
But I have not
Both
had an
the
answer
Senate
yet.
House, the Senate, I just.
Would you tell us whether or not you will encourage her to come and
I have
address those
said
inconsistencies?
to her, as I have said to you, and as I said to Mr. Davis the other day in the House dining room, we are prepared to answer any and
Wonderful.
all legitimate questions that any member of this or the other body might have, Congressman.
Or the government, or the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform.
Either body, yes, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I see my time has expired, and I yield back.
I thank you. The chair